There are stories that never leave us. Tales not just of kings and queens, but of the bloodlines that shaped, and sometimes haunted, the course of human history. Most families pass on heirlooms, memories, traditions. But a few pass down power, sacred knowledge, or secrets that made their very existence dangerous. And then, suddenly, these families disappeared. Wiped from the record, their names reduced to footnotes, rumors, or echoes in stone. This isn't about myth. It's about history, moments that were documented, bodies that vanished, dynasties that unraveled overnight. Across centuries and continents, there are bloodlines that rose to prominence, only to vanish under circumstances that remain murky at best, chilling at worst. Some disappeared in silence, children locked away in towers, royal heirs who never emerged from basements, ancient astronomers who left behind instruments but no trace of breath. Others were extinguished with brutal precision, hunted down across empires, their graves scattered or never found at all. What links these stories isn't just the absence of evidence. It's the unsettling feeling that something more than time or chance was at work, that these weren't slow declines or normal generational fading, but deliberate erasures. The kinds of disappearances that leave a vacuum so complete it forces us to ask, what were they hiding? Or perhaps more hauntingly, what were they protecting? History is full of names we remember, the Tudors, the Romanovs, the Medici. But woven into those grand arcs are moments when an entire line was extinguished like a candle in a storm. No heirs, no explanations, just questions. This story isn't a single narrative, but a mosaic of 14 parts. Each one focuses on a different bloodline, their rise, their mysteries, and the strange way they vanished. From the high towers of medieval England to the sacred jungles of Peru, from Byzantine coups to Incan astronomers, each chapter reveals not only what happened, but what it meant to be part of a lineage so powerful that its very existence could become a threat. The tone here is not conspiratorial, but contemplative, because history isn't just about what we know, it's also about what we've lost. These stories offer no easy answers, but they invite us to pause, to reflect, and to wonder what happens when a bloodline becomes too dangerous to survive. In this journey, we'll start with a pair of young princes who vanished behind the walls of the Tower of London and end with an entire family of sky watchers who left behind nothing but a cryptic note. Along the way, we'll uncover fragments of lost dynasties, explore the thin line between power and peril, and ask what it truly means for a family to vanish, not just from sight, but from memory itself. So settle in. Let the echoes of history speak. Because what follows is not just a retelling of the past, it's an exploration of how blood, legacy, and silence have shaped the world we live in. The first mystery begins in the summer of 1483. Two boys, heirs to the throne, seen laughing in a royal garden. And then, nothing. It was a warm summer in 1483, and inside the stone walls of the Tower of London, two boys played in the garden. One was Edward, just 12 years old. The other, his younger brother Richard, was 9. They were princes, sons of the late King Edward IV, and heirs to the English throne. The Tower, still a royal residence at the time, was meant to keep them safe, but that safety would prove illusory. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been named Lord Protector. A man of influence and ambition, he brought Edward to London under the guise of preparation for his coronation as Edward V. Then he ordered Richard and the younger brother to join him. What followed was a series of decisions that shifted the course of English history. Richard declared that his brother's marriage had been illegitimate, rendering both boys legally unfit for the crown. Parliament accepted it. In July of that year, Richard was crowned King Richard III. And the boys? They remained in the Tower. At first, people saw them often, smiling, playing, peering from the windows of their royal quarters. But by the end of the summer, they were gone. No funeral, no bodies, no announcements, just silence. And in that silence, the direct line of the House of York, a family that had waged decades of war to claim the throne, quietly vanished. Centuries passed. In 1674, a worker digging beneath a staircase inside the tower uncovered a wooden box. Inside were two small skeletons, believed to be around the ages the boys would have been. The bones were buried in Westminster Abbey under the title of the missing princes, but modern science was never allowed to test them. DNA analysis requests have been repeatedly denied. Theories abound. That Richard III had them killed to secure his hold on power. That others, political enemies, rival factions, acted without his knowledge. That one or both survived in secret, spirited away to another land, or hidden under a new name. But no theory has ever been proven. All we know is this: two children, rightful heirs to a kingdom, disappeared inside one of the most secure buildings in all of England, and no one ever saw them again. The mystery of the princes in the tower has haunted generations of historians, writers, and citizens. It asks questions about the nature of power, about what lengths people will go to in order to keep it, and what they're willing to sacrifice. It also speaks to something deeper: the fragility of innocence in a world ruled by ambition. The York bloodline, once the center of English royal power, ended not in war or natural death, but in quiet disappearance. Their absence left a void that shaped the Tudor era, altered succession, and cast a long shadow over England's past. Richard III's reign was short. He died in battle just 2 years later, and with his death, the Wars of the Roses gave way to a new dynasty. But the mystery remained. No matter how much time passed, the image of two boys behind ancient stone walls, alive one moment, gone the next, lingered. A question whispered through history: what happened to the princes in the tower? And if they could vanish without a trace, who else could? A royal family awakened by gunfire in the dead of night. The year was 1918, and the Romanov dynasty, rulers of Russia for over 300 years, was about to end in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were led downstairs by Bolshevik guards under the pretense of relocation. Moments later, a volley of bullets echoed into history, but when the burial site was discovered decades later, something didn't add up. Only 9 bodies were found. The remains of Tsar Nicholas, the Empress, 3 of their daughters, and 4 loyal attendants. Missing were 2 of the children, the young heir Alexei, and 1 of the daughters, possibly Maria or Anastasia. For over 70 years, the mystery lingered. Had the children somehow escaped? Had they been hidden? Or was something else concealed beneath the official story? By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, rumors of Romanov survivors had become legend. Anna Anderson, the most famous of the claimants, insisted until her death in 1984 that she was Anastasia. Books, films, and whispered stories kept the question alive. Then in 2007, a second burial site was discovered just miles from the first. Inside were charred bone fragments, 2 small skeletons, incomplete, but consistent with children's remains. DNA testing indicated they were the missing Romanov children. Case closed, or so it seemed. Yet the Russian Orthodox Church challenged the results, citing concerns about the scientific process. The government reopened the investigation. To this day, the mystery remains unresolved in the eyes of many Russians. But beyond the forensics, something about the Romanovs' final days feels heavy with symbolic weight. The fall of an empire distilled into a single night of chaos and violence. A royal family swept away by revolution, and 2 missing children who came to embody the unanswered questions of a nation in turmoil. What makes this story so compelling isn't just whether they lived or died. It's the collective obsession, the deep need to believe that someone survived, that in a world unraveling there might still be a thread of continuity, a flicker of hope. Even with modern DNA analysis, some questions remain. Were the remains tampered with? Were the identities mistaken? Could someone have orchestrated a cover-up during the early days of Soviet power? Or were the doubts themselves born from grief, from the human desire to resist finality? What's undeniable is this: the Romanovs were erased with brutal speed. A family that had ruled the world's largest country vanished from power overnight. And for decades, 2 children were unaccounted for, their fate obscured by fire, politics, and rumor. The mystery of the missing Romanov children forces us to confront how fragile history can be, not just in facts, but in memory. Because when power collapses, it doesn't always leave a clean record. Sometimes it leaves shadows, and in those shadows, truth and legend become nearly impossible to untangle. And so we are left with an image, not of a czar or an empress, but of a child stepping through a basement door into a moment that would never be fully explained. A vanished bloodline, a missing heir, and a nation still asking what really happened that night in Ekaterinburg. Imagine a city larger than London in its day, rising from the heart of what is now the American Midwest. Around the year 1100, Cahokia stood near the banks of the Mississippi River, a sprawling metropolis of mounds, plazas, and sacred geometry. At its center lived a powerful elite, a ruling bloodline whose authority was written into the very earth. They built monumental earthen platforms, some taller than 10-story buildings, and lived atop them, separated from the common folk below. Then, by the mid-1300s, they were gone. The disappearance of Cahokia's ruling class wasn't gradual. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Elite compounds burned to the ground, their inhabitants already gone. No bodies, no signs of battle, just charred remnants of once imposing structures and a silence stretching across centuries. Cahokia was no primitive village. It was a city of complexity, planned with astronomical precision, organized neighborhoods, trade routes reaching far beyond the horizon. The ruling elite didn't just control politics, they controlled the cosmos, aligning their lives with solstices and star paths. Graves found in ceremonial mounds suggest a hereditary class, individuals buried with exquisite goods, their status clearly inherited, not earned. These weren't just leaders. They were symbols of divine order. So when their world began to unravel around 1350, it wasn't just a population decline. Something more sudden and targeted occurred. The elite vanished, but not by massacre. Their compounds were deliberately burned, fast, intense fires set while the structures were empty. Residential areas, by contrast, show a slow abandonment. People drifted away. But the rulers? They disappeared all at once. Archaeologists have searched other regional sites for signs of Cahokia's ruling bloodline, looking for burial markers, genetic clues, artifacts that might suggest migration. But they found nothing, no continuation, no survivors. A powerful dynasty, one that had ruled tens of thousands, simply ceased to be. By the time European explorers arrived in the 1600s, the local tribes had no memory of Cahokia's rulers. The mounds were there, immense, mysterious, but the names of the builders were lost. Oral histories offered vague legends, but no direct lineage. The memory had faded, as if the earth itself had swallowed the story. What happened? Some suggest revolt, a rebellion against hereditary power. Others point to environmental stress, drought, or internal collapse. But no mass graves, no documented refugees, no adopted elite in neighboring societies. The rulers didn't die fighting. They simply vanished. The mystery of Cahokia's lost bloodline challenges our understanding of civilization itself. In a world obsessed with permanence, Here was a culture that reached incredible heights, then left almost no trace of its leadership. The most powerful people in pre-Columbian North America disappeared without a footprint. Perhaps they were killed, perhaps they fled, or perhaps they chose to disappear, seeing something coming that others could not. What remains is not just a gap in the archaeological record, but in the human story, a reminder that even the mightiest cities can fall, and that sometimes the ones who built them leave no one behind to tell the tale. The story of Cahokia isn't just about a vanished city. It's about the people who led it, and how, even in a civilization built from earth and vision, power can dissolve without a trace. It happened in a single day. September 1185, Constantinople. The heart of the Byzantine Empire pulsed with chaos as a mob stormed the palace gates. By nightfall, Emperor Andronikos Phrygios Komnenos had been captured, dragged through the streets, and brutally executed. But the death of the emperor was only the beginning. What followed was a systematic purge unlike anything seen before in Byzantine history. Every known member of the Komnenos dynasty living in the capital, cousins, nephews, distant relatives, was hunted down and killed. The violence was swift and merciless. In a city long accustomed to political intrigue, this was different. It was total. The Komnenos family had ruled for over a century. They weren't a fringe lineage clawing for power. They were the empire. Through marriages, military appointments, and provincial governance, their bloodline stretched across the Mediterranean world, which is what made what happened next so haunting. As news of the palace coup spread, imperial officials reached out to the provinces, hoping to negotiate with surviving Komnenos claimants, but there were none. Reports came in from Armenia, Greece, Trebizond, even Italy. Every branch of the family had suffered sudden, seemingly unrelated deaths. A cousin fell from a horse. A military governor died of spoiled food. A naval commander drowned. A noblewoman succumbed to fever, all within a 2-week span. Communication in the 12th century was slow. It could take weeks or months for news to travel from Constantinople to outlying territories. Yet somehow, across vast distances and isolated provinces, the deaths of every known Komnenos family member occurred almost simultaneously. The new regime ordered an investigation. Chroniclers documented each death, searching for patterns. But the deaths seemed disconnected. Some violent, others accidental, still others from illness. No evidence of a coordinated plot, no shadow network of assassins. And yet, the result was the same: an entire imperial bloodline erased within days. The Komnenos dynasty had produced emperors, generals, and scholars. Their reign was marked by military successes and cultural revival, and yet they vanished with an efficiency that defied the limits of their own time. Historians have debated the mystery for centuries. Was it a coordinated purge masked as coincidence? A series of tragic accidents accelerated by the chaos of regime change? Or was it something else entirely, a reflection of how vulnerable even the most powerful bloodlines can be when the political tides shift? What remains chilling is not just the loss of a dynasty, but the silence that followed. No legitimate heir ever stepped forward. No memoir, no exile, no surviving child hidden in a distant monastery. Just death, and then nothing. The Komnenos disappearance reminds us that history is not always written in stone. Sometimes it is swept clean, as if a family that once ruled an empire had never existed. The archives still bear their names, but their future was cut short with surgical precision. In a world where power once passed through blood, the sudden death of every drop of that blood raises a question that echoes through time. How does a lineage end in the age before modern surveillance, before telegraphs or phones, and yet appear so perfectly timed it seems impossible? Sometimes the greatest mysteries of history aren't about what we see. They're about what vanishes before we can. High in the cloud-covered Andes, beyond the Spanish conquest's reach, the Inca whispered of a place called Paiti, the hidden city. A refuge not of stone and gold alone, but of knowledge, of memory, and, according to legend, a sacred bloodline entrusted to protect it. In the wake of the empire's fall, after the last Inca emperor was captured in 1572, Spanish chroniclers began hearing the same name repeated by captured nobles, the keepers of Paiti. They were not warriors or royalty in the traditional sense. They were guardians, a family sworn to protect the location of the empire's most treasured secrets. Where the sacred was hidden, only they knew. Driven by greed and fear, the Spanish hunted them. They believed that within Paiti lay vast treasures of gold and silver, untouched by conquest. Any Inca who showed signs of being a keeper was detained, interrogated, or worse. But something strange kept happening. They kept dying. A suspected keeper arrested in 1574 died overnight in his cell, his throat swollen shut. In 1580, another fell from a cliff before he could be questioned. In 1586, a woman identified as a possible keeper collapsed from a sudden fever and was dead within hours. By 1610, Spanish records noted with frustration that every identified keeper had perished, many before giving a single answer. Not one heir, not one confession. The bloodline had vanished. This wasn't war. This wasn't chaos. It was silence, calculated and tragic. Some of the deaths seemed natural, others suspicious. There were cases of suspected keepers refusing to eat, wasting away even under forced feeding. Others slipped into deep, unshakable trances, dying days later. Was this trauma, loyalty, or something more ritualistic? A choice to die with their secret rather than see it betrayed. By the early 1600s, the Spanish gave up the pursuit. The knowledge of Paiti, if it had ever truly existed, had been buried with its guardians. Expeditions continued over the centuries, searching the jungles of Peru and Brazil. All returned empty-handed. The city, if it was real, remained elusive. But what's more compelling than the city itself is the idea of a bloodline so bound to its duty that it chose death over betrayal. Generations of oral memory, astronomical alignment, sacred objects, all safeguarded not by weapons but by silence. The disappearance of the keepers of Paiti challenges what we think we know about conquest. It shows that power isn't always destroyed in battle. Sometimes it vanishes by decision, evaporated by those who understand that survival isn't always physical. Did the keepers possess maps? A prophecy? Did they believe that to speak the location aloud would unleash disaster? Or was it simply a vow, a promise kept so tightly it left no trace? We don't know, and perhaps that's the point. The Spanish chroniclers left behind pages of confusion and despair, writing of shadows, of names lost to time, of men and women who would rather vanish than yield. And centuries later, the jungle still holds its secret. The story of the keepers is not just a mystery. It is a testament to the power of unspoken knowledge. A bloodline that disappeared, not through war or disease, but through unwavering devotion to something larger than themselves, something they refuse to let the world exploit. And maybe that's why Paiti has never been found, because it wasn't just a place, it was a promise. The crown sat heavy on Henry VIII's head, not because of its weight, but because of the future it demanded. In 1509, he ascended the English throne full of vigor and youth. But behind the grandeur, a singular obsession soon consumed him, producing a male heir to secure the Tudor line. What followed was a reign defined by upheaval, 6 marriages, a national break from the Catholic Church, and a trail of severed alliances and severed heads, all for one purpose, to ensure that his name, his blood, would live on in a son who could carry the Tudor legacy forward. He got that son, briefly. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, bore him Edward in 1537. She died just days later. Edward VI became king at just 9 years old after Henry's death in 1547. Bright but frail, the boy ruled for 6 years before succumbing to tuberculosis at age 15. He left no heirs. That wasn't the only male line Henry pursued. His illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, was born to a mistress in 1519. Though technically outside the line of succession, Henry VIII had acknowledged him, granted him noble titles, and was rumored to be preparing to legitimize him as a backup heir. Fitzroy was healthy, promising, and then without warning, he died at 17. Officially, the cause was consumption, but the suddenness, the secrecy of his burial stirred rumors of poisoning, political fears, quiet eliminations. Within 2 decades of Henry VIII's death, the Tudor male line had vanished. Every male descendant, legitimate or not, was dead. Henry's daughters ruled after Edward, Mary, then Elizabeth. Both formidable monarchs, yet neither left heirs. Elizabeth I never married. With her death in 1603, the Tudor dynasty came to a final childless end. The irony is staggering. A king who tore apart the religious and political fabric of England to secure a male legacy left behind a bloodline erased within a single generation. All the maneuvering, the divorces, the executions, none could alter the fate written into his lineage. Some historians suggest a medical cause. Perhaps Henry carried a genetic disorder, something that caused miscarriages and frailty in his offspring. Others point to political intrigue and suspicious timing in the deaths of Fitzroy and Edward. But no clear answer has ever surfaced. What remains is the image of a man so consumed by legacy that he remade a nation in its pursuit, only to have it slip through his fingers. The end of the Tudor male line isn't just a story of mortality. It's a reminder of how fragile dynasties can be, no matter how powerful the throne. Bloodlines, for all their privilege, are still vulnerable to disease, to circumstance, to fate. In the silence that followed Elizabeth I's reign, the throne passed to a distant cousin, James VI of Scotland. The Tudors were no more. Their bloodline, which had reshaped England, Europe, and the Church itself, ended not with rebellion, but with the slow extinguishing of a family line. Henry VIII had done everything to guarantee that wouldn't happen. And yet, despite all his might, he could not force the future. In his pursuit of a son, he changed the world, but in the end, his name died with his daughters, and the Tudor line became history, remembered not for what it built, but for what it lost. It began with a sudden illness. In October 1587, Francesco de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, fell violently sick while at his villa. His wife, Bianca Capello, collapsed soon after. Within 2 days, both were dead. Officially, the cause was malaria, but the circumstances, and what followed, suggest something far more deliberate. Francesco was part of one of Europe's most powerful families. The Medici had shaped Renaissance Italy for generations through banking, art patronage, and political cunning. But Francesco's branch of the family was different, a line that had deviated from expectations, especially when he married Bianca, his mistress, against his family's wishes. That decision sparked bitter rivalries, particularly with his younger brother Ferdinando, a cardinal with ambitions of his own. Ferdinando renounced his religious position shortly after Francesco's death and assumed power. He moved swiftly, burying the couple with little ceremony. Then people close to Francesco began to die, one by one. His children from a previous marriage fell ill or met with strange accidents. One drowned, another died on a hunting trip. Bianca's relatives were stripped of power, some vanishing entirely. Members of Francesco's household, his staff, advisors, even distant cousins, died or disappeared. Within 2 years, nearly every trace of his branch of the Medici family had been wiped from Florence. Modern forensic science offers chilling confirmation. Hair samples from Francesco and Bianca revealed high levels of arsenic, consistent with poisoning. The deaths weren't just suspicious, they were calculated. Ferdinando consolidated control, and history moved on. The Medici remained influential, but the line descended from Francesco was gone. Not just displaced, erased. Political poisoning was not rare in Renaissance courts. What sets this case apart is the thoroughness, a methodical elimination not just of a ruler, but of an entire bloodline. It wasn't about removing a rival, it was about making sure no one could rise in his name. What motivated such a purge? Was it jealousy, revenge, or fear of future claims to power? Ferdinando had reason to resent Francesco, but to destroy an entire lineage suggests something deeper, a vision of power that could tolerate no echoes of the past. The Medici were no strangers to betrayal. Their history is laced with assassination plots, shifting alliances, and dark secrets. But the extinguishing of Francesco's line reveals the vulnerability of even the most secure dynasties. Blood, once spilled, leaves traces, but sometimes those traces are deliberately scrubbed from the record. Today, visitors to Florence walk the halls of Medici palaces, gazing at portraits, jewels, and marble busts. But few notice the empty spaces, the missing branches of the family tree, the children whose names faded from the archives. Francesco's line had once held promise. His union with Bianca was scandalous, yes, but also symbolic, a merging of ambition and love in a world ruled by strategy. Their deaths and the deaths of those who followed turned that promise to ash. The Medici were known for creating beauty, but also for destroying threats. And in this case, the threat was not war or rebellion, it was lineage itself. A name that once carried power now exists only in footnotes. A bloodline vanished not by chance but by careful design. High in the mountains of northern Persia, the fortress of Alamut once stood as a symbol of fear and devotion. From this stronghold, the order of assassins, the Hashashin, operated for nearly 2 centuries. Their leaders, known as imams, claimed sacred descent from the Prophet Muhammad, and their power rested not only in blades, but in blood. Then, in 1256, the Mongols arrived. Led by Hulagu Khan, the Mongol army laid siege to Alamut with a patience and precision unmatched by previous enemies. Starvation weakened the defenders. Eventually, the final imam, Rukn al-Din Kursha, surrendered. He was promised safety in exchange for ordering the surrender of other fortresses. He complied. The Mongols accepted the capitulation, then executed Rukn al-Din. Brutal, yes, but not unexpected for Mongol conquest. What followed, however, was far more unsettling. Inside Alamut, the Mongols discovered the assassins' genealogical records, meticulous lists tracing the imam bloodline. This wasn't a typical family tree. It was a sacred lineage, the source of the order's authority. And for reasons no one fully understands, the Mongols decided to obliterate it. Over the next 5 years, they hunted down every documented descendant of the imam bloodline. Across villages, towns, and remote mountain settlements, soldiers arrived with names. They executed men, women, even children, sometimes people who had no role in the order, only ancestral ties. The level of coordination is staggering for the time. In an era before telegraphs or central bureaucracy, they tracked and eliminated an entire family tree. Historical records describe soldiers appearing in distant towns, asking for specific individuals, then vanishing after completing their task. There were no survivors, no known descendants. The bloodline was extinguished. Why? The Mongols were known for ruthlessness but also pragmatism. Usually they killed resistors and absorbed the rest. They rarely pursued annihilation with such focus. Was it fear of resurgence, a belief that the blood itself posed a threat? Or did they suspect the imams held secret knowledge? the kind that could inspire future uprisings? The answer may lie in what the assassins represented. They were more than a military order. They were a spiritual movement. Their leaders were seen not just as rulers, but as living symbols of divine authority. To the Mongols, this bloodline may have embodied a threat that couldn't be conquered, only erased. The genealogies, along with the fortress itself, were destroyed. We only know of them from chroniclers who described Mongol soldiers holding lists. The records are gone. The bloodline, once considered sacred, vanished into history. What lingers is the sense of precision. This wasn't genocide in the chaotic sense. It was elimination, intentional, targeted, cold. And so, the Imam bloodline, once central to one of the most feared and respected movements in the Islamic world, was silenced. Not just killed, but scrubbed from continuity. We often think of legacy as something unbreakable, passed on through names, stories, traditions. But this story reminds us, legacy can be fragile. Even sacred bloodlines, even those fortified by mountains and belief, can be reduced to ash if someone decides that their very existence is intolerable. The mountains remain. The legends persist. But the blood is gone, taken not by war alone, but by the idea that no one must remain to claim what once was. The Habsburgs ruled Europe for centuries, their name etched into the very architecture of empires. They were emperors, kings, and queens, architects of war and diplomacy. But behind the grandeur lay a darker legacy, one forged in blood, not just figuratively, but literally. For generations, the Habsburgs married within their own ranks, cousins wedding cousins in a desperate effort to preserve power. This inbreeding led to well-documented physical deformities, the most famous being the Habsburg jaw, a pronounced underbite so severe in some cases that speaking and eating became difficult. But in the late 1700s, a new affliction emerged in one particular branch of the family. Not a physical trait, a psychological one. This line descended from Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, specifically through his youngest son, Archduke Anton Victor. At first, nothing seemed unusual. His children were born healthy, lived normal childhoods, and took on roles in court and clergy. But then, as each reached their early 30s, something began to change. It started with paranoia. They grew suspicious of their families, convinced they were being watched or poisoned. Then came hallucinations, voices, visions, fears that couldn't be explained. Within months, they would descend into catatonia, unresponsive to the world around them, and then, inevitably, death. One by one, each of Anton Victor's children followed the same path. Then his grandchildren. The pattern was chillingly consistent. Doctors at the time were helpless, describing the condition with vague terms like brain fever or nervous affliction. Treatments failed. Isolation didn't help. No one survived. By 1820, this entire branch of the Habsburg dynasty had died out. Every descendant succumbed to the same mysterious mental collapse. The bloodline was extinguished not by assassination or war, but by something locked deep within their own DNA. Modern researchers, studying fragmentary records, have speculated. Huntington's disease, perhaps, or a rare prion disorder like fatal familial insomnia. But without biological samples, it's all theory. The family crypts remain sealed, and the Austrian government has refused genetic testing. What's left is a puzzle, a pattern of inherited madness that haunted a powerful lineage until it was no more. For the Habsburgs, who prided themselves on control, on dynastic calculation, this was an outcome they could neither predict nor prevent. Their attempt to purify and preserve their bloodline may have created the very mutation that destroyed it. And in that irony lies a profound truth. Power can be a prison. The tighter you cling to legacy, the more vulnerable you become to the consequences of that obsession. The Habsburgs controlled half of Europe, but they could not control the darkness hiding within their own genes. This lost branch, now nearly forgotten, reminds us that dynasties are not only threatened from without. Sometimes they collapse from within. The grandeur of palaces, the formality of royal portraits, all of it masks a simple biological truth. We are all bound by what runs through our blood. And for this branch of the Habsburgs, that blood carried not glory or strength, but silence, confusion, and a quiet inherited end. No one from this line survives. No children, no claimants. Just records, clinical, tragic, of a family erased by something no army could fight, itself. In the remote heights of the Peruvian Andes, Spanish colonial officials once made note of an unusual family, known as the Guardianes del Tiempo, the guardians of time. They were said to be the last remnants of the Inca's astronomical priesthood. Their duty, to track the stars, predict celestial events, and maintain the sacred calendar of a fallen empire. Unlike other native groups, the Spanish did not suppress them. Their astronomical precision proved useful. They could predict eclipses, solstices, and seasonal cycles more accurately than European calendars of the time, so they were tolerated. A small monastery was built for them, isolated and peaceful, a place where time was measured not in politics, but in the movement of the heavens. Then, in 1687, they disappeared. A Spanish priest named Father Domingo made the journey to their mountain outpost to consult on proposed calendar reforms. He expected a scholarly exchange, maybe a modest meal. Instead, he found silence. The gates were open, the fires cold, personal belongings were left behind. Instruments still pointed toward the stars. The Endir family of 40 people across 4 generations had vanished. No signs of struggle. No blood. No indication they'd packed and fled. Just empty rooms, a tower filled with untouched star charts, and one cryptic note. In the family's observatory, a final entry had been recorded in careful handwriting. The calculation is complete. The door is open. We have gone through. Below it, a geometric symbol no Spanish priest recognized, intricate, precise, and eerily symmetrical. Search parties combed the mountains. No graves were found. No trails. No reports of nearby disease or attack. The monastery was eventually abandoned. The records were collected, stored in colonial archives, and the Guardians del Tiempo faded into myth. Were they taken? Did they flee some unseen threat? Or, as the more mystical among the priests whispered, did they really find something predicted in their calculations? Their story became legend in Andean folklore. Some believed they had crossed into another realm, a dimension marked not by geography, but by alignment, that the stars they studied so closely had shown them a moment of passage, a celestial door, and they had gone through it. Others were more pragmatic. Perhaps they fled to avoid scrutiny, fearing the Inquisition might turn against them. But that theory never aligned with the evidence. They had always cooperated, always been protected. There was no immediate threat, and they had left everything behind: clothes, food, children's toys. What gives this story its staying power is not the suggestion of magic or abduction, but the sheer completeness of the disappearance. 40 people, trained in ancient knowledge, vanished overnight, leaving only the whisper of a fulfilled equation. Even today, the records remain in archives in Lima. Most have never been fully translated. Few have studied the astronomical calculations, written in a mix of Spanish and Quechua. The symbol left behind remains unexplained. Were they merely astronomers with a spiritual flair, or custodians of a far older knowledge, one passed down from Inca priests who saw the universe as a living clock? Whatever the truth, the Guardians del Tiempo remind us that not all knowledge is meant to be inherited. Some is kept, preserved in silence, and then taken when the time is right. A bloodline vanished not by sword or sickness, but perhaps by choice, or by invitation from the stars they had spent their lives watching. And in the stillness of that abandoned monastery, One phrase lingers like an unanswered question. The door is open. We have gone through. In the silence of forgotten rooms, some bloodlines fade slowly, lost to time. But others vanish with speed and precision, as if someone or something made sure they would never be remembered. Across continents and centuries, 10 families, royal, sacred, or scholarly, disappeared so completely that their absence leaves a chill in the historical record. The princes in the tower, whose laughter once echoed through royal gardens, disappeared without a trace. The Romanov children, whose fate remained uncertain even in the age of DNA, became symbols of unresolved tragedy. The rulers of Cahokia, whose palaces were torched while they were already gone, left no burial, no memory. The Komnenos wiped out across an empire in 2 weeks. The keepers of Piety, who chose death over betrayal. The Tudor male line, extinguished despite a king's desperate obsession. Francesco de' Medici's branch, erased by poison and silence. The assassins' imams, hunted to extinction using their own genealogies. The Habsburgs of Anton Victor's line, consumed from within by a genetic curse, and the guardians of time, who seemed to follow their calculations into something beyond comprehension. What makes these disappearances haunting isn't just that people died. It's how fast and thoroughly their lines were removed, as if someone had not only ended them, but scrubbed the evidence. No heirs, no whispers, just space where a legacy should have been. Some of these stories suggest deliberate extermination. Others suggest secrets so precious they were buried with their keepers. Still others show how power, left unchecked, can turn inward and destroy itself. A poisoned brother, a bloodline of madness, a secret city never betrayed. And woven through all of them is a question. What does it mean for a bloodline to vanish? Not just in terms of names and records, but in culture, in memory. When a family disappears entirely, something else often disappears with them. A language, a belief system, a thread of human understanding that had passed from parent to child for generations. In some cases, these vanishings suggest that knowledge can be dangerous. The keepers of Piety and the guardians of time didn't just hold information, they embodied it. Perhaps that made their existence intolerable or simply too sacred to be risked. Their silence may have been the last act of devotion. Other disappearances seem rooted in power or its collapse. The Komnenos dynasty fell not only from the throne but from history, their lineage severed with improbable efficiency. The Medici branch's elimination showed that even within a powerful family, fear of inheritance can be lethal, and Henry VIII's obsession with sons only made the loss of them more absolute. Some vanishings challenge the idea that bloodlines can secure permanence. The Habsburgs built a European superstructure of intermarriage and influence, yet one branch collapsed without a sword being drawn, undone by the very blood it tried to preserve. We often think of history in terms of survival: who built, who ruled, who passed on their name. But these stories tell the other side, the quiet erasures, the families whose stories ended not in glory or exile, but in disappearance. And that leads to the most unsettling idea of all. These are only the families we know about. These 10 left just enough evidence to raise questions. But how many others disappeared so completely that no one remembers they ever existed? In a world where legacy is prized and lineage is currency, these vanishings are reminders. Not all stories are meant to continue. Not all names are meant to last, and sometimes the most profound part of a legacy is the moment it ends and leaves nothing behind but silence. The stories of these vanished bloodlines don't end with the facts. They end in the questions they leave behind, questions that echo through archives, ruins, and unmarked graves. We are left to wonder not just how these families disappeared, but why. Why were the princes in the tower never seen again? Who made the decision to silence them? And what were they trying to prevent? What did the Romanov children know, if anything, that could inspire imposters and legends for decades. Why was the Cahokia elite burned out so precisely, so completely, as if to erase not just a leadership class, but a worldview? What kind of power did the keepers of Paiti protect, and why were they willing to die for it, silently without ever giving it up? What calculation did the guardians of time complete? What door did they open? Were they fleeing something, or had they fulfilled a prophecy that no one else could understand? These aren't just historical curiosities. They're philosophical challenges, because each vanished bloodline reveals a different truth about the fragility of legacy, the burden of knowledge, and the cost of power. Power, after all, isn't always seized on a battlefield. Sometimes it is inherited, in name, in belief, in secrets. And that kind of power is harder to see, but more dangerous to those who fear what it might become. In many of these stories, knowledge was inseparable from blood. The assassins' imams maintained records of sacred descent. The guardians tracked time and stars with precision that may have gone beyond the merely scientific. The keepers of Paiti may have remembered something the world was not meant to rediscover. Others tell of dynasties undone by their own ambition. The Tudors reshaped a nation for an heir who never lived to adulthood. The Habsburgs collapsed under the weight of their own genes. The Medici, once symbols of art and elegance, became architects of silence within their own family. And yet these endings weren't always loud. More often they were quiet, clinical, hidden, or unexplained. That silence is what haunts us. We expect stories to leave trails, documents, descendants, monuments. When they don't, it forces us to reckon with a deeper possibility, that history, like people, can choose to disappear. What do we make of that choice? When a family with sacred knowledge lets itself vanish rather than risk corruption? When a lineage is hunted down not for what it's done, but for what it represents? And what does that say about us? The ones left behind, searching the past for meaning. Are we drawn to these disappearances because we hope to find answers? Or because we sense that, in the spaces where history goes silent, we might glimpse something closer to truth? These vanished bloodlines form a hidden map of humanity, a network of stories not just about power lost, but about the price of legacy. They are not cautionary tales in the traditional sense. They don't warn us against ambition. They invite us to ask what we're really trying to preserve when we speak of names, nations, and heritage. Sometimes survival isn't the greatest achievement. Sometimes the decision to vanish is itself a legacy. And in that, perhaps these families are not truly gone. Their stories, incomplete as they are, still speak, in whispers, in ruins, in the haunting clarity of what isn't there. One final chapter remains. A reflection not just on what we've lost, but on what we choose to remember. We began with questions about power, blood, and disappearance. And now, at the edge of this journey, one more question lingers. What does it mean to truly vanish? In history books, power often seems immortal. We're taught to believe in continuity, that royal lines pass smoothly, that knowledge is preserved, that memory endures. But the stories we've traced tell a different tale, one where legacy is fragile, one where even the most exalted bloodlines can vanish, not in dramatic battle, but in the quiet gaps of the historical record. Some families vanished in silence, like the princes in the tower, or the guardians del tiempo. Others were destroyed in waves, by politics, by genetics, by deliberate design. But all left behind a void, not just the absence of people, but the absence of continuity. And that absence has meaning. It reminds us that no amount of power can guarantee permanence. That knowledge, no matter how sacred, can be forgotten. That identity, no matter how carefully guarded, can dissolve into rumor and shadow, but it also tells us something more hopeful, that the human desire to remember, to ask, to explore, to reconstruct what was lost, is just as enduring as any bloodline. We continue to search for bones beneath staircases, for city ruins hidden in jungle, for names in dusty ledgers. Because in these vanished families we find more than mystery. We find ourselves, our fear of being forgotten, our hunger to connect past and future, our need to believe that stories once lived matter beyond their final breath. The Romanov children, the Cahokia elite, the assassins' imams, they live on not through descendants, but through curiosity, through the haunting persistence of a question. Why? Why them? Why so complete? Why so fast? Perhaps they knew something. Perhaps they threatened something. Or perhaps their very existence symbolized an idea too dangerous, too uncontrollable to be allowed to continue. We'll never know the full truth. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the silence is part of the message. Because what these bloodlines ultimately left behind wasn't just absence. It was a mirror, one that reflects our fascination with legacy, our discomfort with mystery, and our refusal to let go of stories that haven't finished telling themselves. So here we are, centuries later, still listening for echoes in empty towers, still scanning the stars for a forgotten calculation, still wondering who else might have disappeared without a trace. And as long as we're asking, as long as we remember to ask, then maybe, just maybe, they're not truly gone. Maybe legacy isn't just about survival. Maybe it's about impact, about how deeply a story lingers after the bloodline ends, and maybe, in that way, the vanished never vanish at all. We carry their mysteries with us. We are, in some way, their final descendants.